Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Caleb Bicknell. I'm a sales director here at PowerGym, and we're excited to host a probe webinar today. I know typically PowerGym is known for their Terra webinars and engaging their audience that way, but today we're hosting a probe webinar that we're very excited about, titled Inside ERCOT: How Developers Drive Smarter Energy Investments with Probe. And really I guess the genesis of the title and just the overall, webinar presentation was generated by our customers. Every day we're working with our clients, whether that be consulting or just, supporting different clients with the Probe software, and understanding their needs. And, obviously the grid becoming more congested and constrained is obviously a hot topic, and just more potential risk with various projects. And so, we've just kind of seen that there's, specifically within ERCOT, just because of the market dynamics, there is a need to understand not only thermal injection capability at different point of interconnects, but also the market economics and risks associated with those specific sites. So what we're really proposing, in this webinar is really to take kind of the transmission planning techniques and couple them with production costing analyses such as congestion and basis analysis, and generate an output of kind of the, an overall output of kind of what tells the whole story there. And someone who's been really, instrumental in this approach and who we've worked with for a while is Carlos Cofino. Carlos, we're welcoming him to the webinar today and excited to have him join us. He's a new director of transmission and interconnection at Clēnera. Carlos has been in the industry for some time and has really been, I think, at the forefront of the intersection between this planning and market economics crossroads. And he's also just been a PowerGym customer for a while, and we've really enjoyed working with him. And so during the webinar, kind of generally, Carlos is going to describe the problems he's looking to solve in his new role, why he's continued to choose PowerGym products within his role, and then what are some quantifiable business outcomes he's looking to achieve. In addition to Carlos, I want to introduce you guys to Jim David. Jim is the Director of Market Applications for PowerGym. Jim has been with PowerGym for 17 years. And if you follow him on LinkedIn, he is known as the Probe guy. So definitely reps us well out in the market. But in addition to kind of leading Probe software efforts, Jim has spent time consulting and supporting, the more, usability of Probe in the day-to-day use of it. So he has a really good value there. In addition to, he spent a lot of time working for New York ISO, so has a great knowledge of the market itself. Next slide, please. All right, so what to expect in today's webinar? We have a few key points here. But I think at the end of the day, the central theme is, planning scenarios don't tell the entire story. Really diving a little bit deeper into what Probe has to offer adds an extra layer of insight that we think is needed to really make solid decisions. And so we're going to identify some key problems required to solve in the ERCOT market. We're going to discuss selection criteria and planning scenarios. And Carlos is going to discuss a specific ERCOT market use case. Then we'll discuss some successful outcomes associated with those, and then kind of take what we learned within those buckets there and really discuss how we can apply those outside of ERCOT, because not everything that we're going to be discussed today is only applied to ERCOT. We can apply it outside of ERCOT as well. And then lastly, we'll wrap up with some Q&A. So just some housekeeping. Before we get moving here. Obviously, you guys were muted upon entry. If you have any questions, please submit those through our Q&A function here. Please submit those throughout the webinar. You don't have to hold those to the end. we will be kind of organizing those on the back end to make sure that we can provide those to Carlos and Jim as needed during the Q&A session. And then we'll be recording this webinar, and it will be available on demand afterwards. And if you have any questions, please email sales at powergym.com with any further questions. I want to kick it over to Jim to begin with the discussion with Carlos. Jim, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Caleb. Yeah, as Caleb mentioned, he did most of my introduction for me, so I'll be brief. As Caleb mentioned, I've been working energy markets for a long time, right? I was in market design at the New York ISO. I love working in energy markets. I have a real passion for it. I like to say I was there kind of early on at the start of energy markets. I don't want to date myself too much, but it's been great experience, working since the early days of energy markets, coming over to PowerGem, 17 years, and working on Probe pretty much the whole time. I appreciate Caleb mentioning that I did consulting studies with Probe. That was really important experience to step away from the product manager position for a while and do those consulting studies, and then come back and get the experience as a user, come back to the product manager position. And I was almost my own best customer, right? I experienced that like a customer, like a product manager. I was able to come back to the Probe team, 6, 7, 8 years ago and say, here's the things, we need to do to make Probe really, really kind of as usable as possible. So that's just a little bit more on my background. I'm going to go ahead now and let Carlos introduce himself and his background.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate the introduction. Carlos Cofino. I'm currently the Director of Transmission and Interconnection at Clēnera. I started my career in power and utilities as a transmission planning engineer at a generation and transmission cooperative called Wabash Valley Power Alliance, where I spent about 2 years as a transmission planning. Later on, I moved on to a role as a transmission engineer for a renewable energy development company called Enlight Renewables, and I managed the transmission strategy team there, mostly managing projects through their generator interconnection process, as well as supporting prospecting siting strategies for new greenfield development. And in my role at Clēnera, I'm doing something very similar, which includes also prospecting siting analyses, managing projects through their interconnection cycles, and also, doing and integrating congestion risks for lending entities and bankable reports as well. So very excited to be here with y'all today.
All right. Thanks, Carlos. Let's go ahead and jump a little bit into the agenda, into our discussion. With kind of a high level question. We can get into the deep dive later. So at the high level, how would you say ERCOT is different from a market like the market that I worked in for so many years, start my career, New York ISO or another market? What makes ERCOT special?
That's a great question, Jim. I would say that in the context of generator interconnection, ERCOT operates under a connect and manage framework. And what this essentially means is that generators can interconnect without the transmission build out that could facilitate a project's delivery under system conditions. And any reliability issues that a project might introduce to the system are later mitigated by the use of either remedial action schemes and curtailment or combination thereof in operations.
All right, great. Can you share a little bit more specifically in ERCOT, what problems you are seeing or needed to solve in the ERCOT market as far as expanding study capabilities?
Sure. So with low barriers to interconnection come a lot of positive things like speed to market, for example, and more manageable project capital cost. But with that, projects in ERCOT might face heightened exposures to curtailments and operational basis risks due to transmission congestion. We might experience oversaturation of generation, increased load profiles that are not accounted for in planning studies. And without that transmission build out, it's difficult to hedge that risk. So as planners, we're tasked with, how do we identify those risks earlier on in the product development cycles. So we need insight to those economic metrics around product curtailment and bases that will inform us how to size our products and where to locate these products at to make sure that these products are ultimately successful.
You mentioned congestion and curtailment. Can we dive a little deeper on that in the context of ERCOT versus others? Would you say that ERCOT is a particularly congested market? Is it widespread congestion? Any comments on that front?
I'd say ERCOT's a particularly congested market. You can see that, throughout years and, how much renewable energy penetrations come to the ERCOT market and, looking at real-time LMPs that you can download from the MIS, you can see where that congestion starts to hit and the trendings along, the years that make up the ERCOT market as a pretty congested market. I'm sure all of you guys are very well aware of the large load that's coming into ERCOT or intends to come into ERCOT. Some might say that load's still pretty speculative, but others might say that it's coming. I'm on the side of the folks that is more inclined to believe that more of that load will come, and we frankly don't have enough generation to serve all of that load that's projected to come in years like 2030. And if you run sked simulations, you're going to realize that you're going to have to add more generation to make they solve and make demand be met by sufficient supply and resource adequacy as well. So I would say ERCOT is a little bit more congested due to that low barrier to interconnection than other markets and that dynamic, resource mix that is allowed to operate within that environment.
Yeah, thanks. And as far as, being, the load growth and being a little thin on resources, I think some of ERCOT's own reports have pointed out those tight reserve margins over time. So one thing for the folks on the attendees, the folks on the call today, we're going to do a little bit too, is we're going to poll you. We're going to ask you a few questions here live. So I've got my colleague Alex Hunter on the call today, and he's got some polls to put up. And if he could, I'll ask Alex to get that going in just a second here. And we would love for you folks to participate. We want to hear from you. We want to keep this lively, interactive, fun, keep the energy. And again, so if you could just take a few minutes and a few seconds, frankly, and submit these polls, we would really appreciate it. So, and I'll give a second for the responses. We're at, good number of responses here. 36 responses. Solar, I don't think there's any surprises here, right? Solar is, the number one investment today. I think batteries are also a very hot topic. I'm actually going to make a few comments on batteries, time permitting, later, because storage is hot. Wind, I guess all renewables, and even a few votes for natural gas. I guess there's a sense that we're not going to meet all this load growth without some natural gas plants as well. Okay, and again, thanks again for the folks who participate. Carlos, why did you choose Terra and Probe for this type of analysis?
I think Terra and Probe together serve complementary purposes, Jim. Terra allows us to perform planning studies that let us screen sites for deliverability. And what that lets us do is identify electrically strong locations. Electrically strong locations are locations that we think are less susceptible to congestion due to reliability issues. And in most cases, products cited at those locations are at lower risk of being hit with bad bases or negative bases or curtailment for that matter. However, planning models don't tell us the whole story. And the Terra analysis is meant just as a first pass to provide a partial view of any physical limitations project might face at the points of interconnection where they're sited at, without incorporating economic metrics. And that's when we shift into Probe. right? After we have a list of, locations that we think are electrically strong candidates for siting projects we run the full-blown 8760 simulations using security constraint economic dispatch principles within Pro. And that lets us get insights into how the assets would operate, in market conditions. And, those outputs produce a lot of great insights like, hourly LMP nodal values, the project performance in terms of curtailment, if the project's curtailed, when it's curtailed, how much it's curtailed, what are the contingencies causing that curtailment, your basis relative to an individual node or a collection of nodes, otherwise known as a hub, right? You could do those calculations after you have a completed probe simulation on the fly because you already have all those LMPs calculated. And that's a great functionality that Probe offers as well. You're also, getting insights to the constraints that are impacting your basis. If you're at the right side of those constraints or at the wrong side of those constraints, which other generators alongside with your helpers or harmers to those constraints. So I think they both serve complementary purposes. They share similar engines and they process, transmission topology pretty similarly. So I think there's great efficiency to be gained by using both Terra and Probe earlier on in the project siting stage.
That's great. Thank you. I just took a quick note over here because I do want to ask you another question. We talk a lot about basis, right? And I can look down the list. I know there's a lot of developers on the call today and they know what that means. And you talked a little bit about a hub. Can you speak a little bit more about what basis is and why it is important to a developer? Because I think maybe not everybody on the call is a developer, or maybe they're newer. Why is that? What is it? Why is it so important?
It's essentially the difference between the LMP value at your point of receipt and your point of delivery. When you're positioning your projects for offtake, you want to make sure that where you want to settle, it is the profitable margins in terms of revenue or potential revenue, and that's guided by the basis calculations.
All right, understood. Thank you. When you were bringing Probe in-house, how does it fit into the development process? Did you replace other tools? Does it complement other tools, or were you just starting fresh to accomplish this, big picture analysis that you were looking at?
To be honest, we're starting fresh. This is something that, something for a developer, I think is pretty innovative. Usually developers rely on third-party consultant studies, as a requirement for bankable entities to finance your projects. And those studies are not kicked off until the project has met specific milestones within its development cycle. So an engine like Probe allows developers to take control of their own destiny and use, those kinds of metrics and analyses for informing siting, for example, and not having to wait until the project's at a specific development point to start using those metrics to inform development decisions. So I think it was something that, it's innovative for developers to take on their own and really, dive into the scenario analyses and just having different perspective and trying to de-risk those potentially negative outcomes the project might face is something that was streamlined, pretty new within our team members.
All right. Let me say a few words here as well about what folks are looking at on the slide and about Probe in general. So what you're looking at here is when Carlos talks about, completing the picture and when does curtailment happen? Nobody wants it to happen at all, but it does, right? When does curtailment happen? What are the average prices, basis, right? So this is all the type of information that you can easily pull out of Probe's dashboard. So what you're looking at here is you can click on any plant down below or just search them in the list up above in the top half, and you can get all these statistics, right? All these economic statistics, hey, curtailment happens, but when? How many hours a year? 1 hour a year? I mean, everybody wants 0 probably, but 1 hour a year, can you live with that? How many megawatt hours are curtailed? So these are all the types of information you get out of an 8760 production cost model. Diving a little deeper about probe from our customers' perspectives, I think some of the things that people really like about probe that might set it apart from some of the other softwares out there are that it's very easy to swap power flow models in probe, right? So keeping this kind of ERCOT specific for now, if you're working ERCOT and you have SSWG models, right? They release those power flow models every twice a year, I think, and they'll have models for 2026 through 2031 or 2032, right? If you're studying 2030, you grab the 2030 SSWG case. If you're studying 2028, you grab the 2028 SSWG case. You just plug those right into probe, no awkward imports or anything, and you can use them directly. So if they come out with new models and you want confidence that it has those latest transmission upgrades, that's not an issue because you can just grab those models from ERCOT and use them in probe. One or two other things. Probe runs N-1 contingency analysis on the fly. There's no need to set up your mon-cons in advance or your flow gates, or some folks call them events. You don't have to do that. Probe, you can just read in your monitored facilities and contingencies, and probe will do that on the fly. And you're not really limited on number of monitored facilities and contingencies. And you never want to be limited on monitored facilities and contingencies because you could miss transmission congestion if you are. And one other thing I'll mention right now, as far as why we think probe or what we think some of the distinct strengths is this dashboard tool that you're looking at. So when you run ERCOT, you're going to get 15 gigabytes of output data for a 1-year simulation, and some folks are studying multiple scenarios, multiple years. With the dashboard tool, you get one output file that you load into one tool, and you get all these calculations. We talk about basis and how important it is. Most folks weight that basis based on dispatch. All those calculations are done for you the second that you load this up into the tool. So just a little bit more insight from the PowerGen perspective about probe and what it does and its strengths. And I think right now I'd like to maybe throw it over to Alex for a second. We want to poll the audience on who's using Terra from our attendees today. So very simple, question, and we'll pause here. Looks like it's going to make me vote too to see the response. So there we go. Okay. I'll also take this opportunity while people are doing that to remind you to put your questions in Q&A now if you want to. You don't have to wait till the end. You can start putting your questions in now. Our team can start looking them over, and we want to save plenty of time for questions. Again, the importance to us of keeping this, somewhat interactive.
Also,
Right
Jim,
now,
hey, real quick,
yeah.
I wanted to jump in and just say, in order to see the results of the polls, you do need to navigate to the chat function within the webinar.
Okay.
Thank you, Jim.
Good to know. Okay. And it looks like, yeah, as Caleb said, you can navigate to the chat function, see the results. We're at 83%. I think we were expecting that. Terra's pretty widespread use, and we're happy to hear that, so many folks are using it. Okay. Let's see. Carlos, a little bit more specifically, can you walk us through what an ERCOT study, you've touched on this a little bit, but let's kind of deeper dive maybe, what a Terra to probe or probe to Terra, I think you said Terra to probe process might look like when you're studying ERCOT.
Yeah, so typically I use what in Terra is called a proportional scale transfer limit analyses, where we test the injection or withdrawal capability at each node within the ERCOT system. You could define a subsystem, as a collection of areas that make up ERCOT, And then the Terra engine allows you to test simultaneously, each of those buses within those electrical areas in the ERCOT region. So what you're doing there is you're incrementally injecting megawatts at a specific bus, and then you're syncing those megawatts from generators that are outside of your study generator. For example, you could define a subsystem of generators that you could proportionally scale down to accommodate that injection. To make sure the power flow case is balanced, and you run N-1 contingency analyses while you're doing that incremental injection, and that lets you see at which level your project might start to introduce constraints in the system, and by constraints I mean thermal overloads, and it gets you the details about your project's distribution factor to the constraint, what contingency is causing the constraint, at which level. So after that, we post-process those reports and we screen each thermal constraints and determine if the thermal constraint is credible. How do we determine that? Well, we see the project's defects relative to the other harmers, and we see, well, for example, if there's a gas plant or another generator that has a higher sensitivity factor to that constraint that might be curtailed first, that might allow you to inject a little bit more headroom without having to overload that constraint. And that's in essence how real-time operations treats these units, right? So after we use those planning simulation results to drive those credible constraints, we do identify which nodes would provide us the more scale at the least potential congestion. And after we have those lists of nodes, then we run each of those nodes individually in the SCED simulation within the probe environment. We run them individually to test their individual plant deliverability and probe and those economic metrics at the individual level. And we also run a scenario that includes the collection of sites that we determined to be electrically strong from our Terra results as a cluster of projects if we were to submit them in a comparable time scheme. And we expect those projects to be synchronized in terms of commercial operation date. We run that cluster scenario as well within probe. So proportional scale transfer limit analyses, steady state planning studies in Terra, post-process for credible constraints, get the list of eligible nodes, and then those eligible nodes that are much more condensed than the list that we started with, we run in probe. Why do we do this? We don't want to test every single node in probe because the 8760 simulations do take a significant amount of time to run. Probe has excellent methods to optimize the simulation times, but the database outputs, the solution outputs for a year are pretty substantial, and we want to allocate our resources and our time to the sites that have a better chance to succeed. So that's why we take that two-step pronged approach in both Terra and probe as well.
Great. Yeah, I think the other question that I was going to ask, I think we've largely answered it, but what outputs, you talked about getting some internal feedback from these tools, maybe even before you get to a bank or investor. But when it gets to that point, what financial outputs are the investors typically looking for? Is it the basis? Is it something else? Maybe it's just one or two things, or is it, can you speak a little bit to that?
Well, for lending entities, investors, and developers in general, we're interested in the project having good basis, right? Low variability, make sure the generator's profit margins are there, right? That means that in order for your power to settle at a specific place, it doesn't have to go through congested areas, or there's a minimization of that instance, right? Another aspect that we're interested in is curtailment. What is curtailment, first of all? When your solar facility, for example, has available power to produce and inject to the grid, but the system can't take your power, so it has to reduce your plant's output, that constitutes curtailment, right? We don't want that, especially in intermittent resources like wind or solar. We want for solar, when solar's available and when wind's available, for those generators to be dispatching. We don't want the system to dictate, for example, how much of that output could be reliably introduced. So that's another, very important aspect. For developers, that we see a plant that has, a lot of curtailment, we might think twice about the project size at which we're, building that site for. Can that curtailment be mitigated by decreasing the project size? It could. Or is there a pre-existing constraint that's adversely impacting your project that's not necessarily introduced by your project, right? Those are the type of metrics that we really do want to scrutinize in the sketch simulation early on as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Project size, like a lot of people might not think about that. I'm sure, most smart developers think about that, right? But maybe they were going big on solar, and the answer isn't to move it, right? Maybe it just needs to be a little smaller, than the location would work, just fine. So let me jump in and speak a little bit to the slide that we're looking at right here. One of the outputs from Probe, when we talk about what are the most impactful constraints, right? We can pick any unit and see from the 8760 analysis, we can, click on literally any unit and pull up all the constraints that impacted that unit. So this, again, tells the story that Carlos is talking about, right? If a constraint is binding for 1 hour, if a constraint is a problem, a local transmission line limit overload is a problem for 1 hour out of 8760, probably who cares, unless you think it might get worse, right? But if it's binding for 848 hours out of the year, well, then you might start to raise your eyebrows and say, is this going to be a problem for my curtailment, for my basis, right? So it's not just the number of hours that you need to look at. It's, of course, the congestion cost associated with the line. It's your sensitivity or shift factor or distribution factor to the line. And all that information is here in these reports. In fact, we've made it even easier by having this normalized hourly average congestion calculation, where we say, hey, taking all those factors into consideration, we can see, we can rank like which are really the worst constraints to you. 800 hours with a tiny little congestion cost and it's 500 miles away with a very low shift factor, probably not a problem. But once you do that math and you say 800 hours, high congestion cost, 8-9% is in this third row here, distribution factor, then you're looking at something that more materially impacts your pricing and your congestion. Okay. Back a little bit, Carlos, more specifically to Probe. How easy was it for you and your team to get up to speed on the Probe software?
Well, my team members were composed of transmission planners. I'm a transmission planner myself, so it was relatively easy for us to pick up the modeling aspect and the software usage itself. It's pretty user friendly. It has a great GUI. You're allowed to craft your own scenarios, use batch mode to process different scenarios at once, and understanding the inputs that go into Probe. The gap or the learning curve was understanding, from a planning perspective, the modeling is one thing, but the economic metrics and how those are tied to the physical, constraints of the sketch simulation, that was a learning curve that, our team was, it had to go through, right? Like everything in life, you have to learn it, but Probe made it really easy. The reporting structures within the dashboard tools and the data management tools within Probe allow you to, get answers to what you might be looking for relatively quickly. The information is there at the unit level, so it's easier to learn through that process and through those interfaces with Probe itself. All the outputs are Excel based and the inputs are Excel based as well. So that's great if you need to manipulate data, and we use a lot of Python scripting to manipulate data as well. It's easy to do within Probe. You can drive Probe using Python. So it's something that as planners we did use and we did integrate with the planning software, that was something super useful. So the market optimization theory, understanding where to get that data from Probe was a learning curve that was easy to bridge with Probe.
Great, thanks. Yeah, I'm happy to hear that you're using Python. Yeah, it's a great feature. I think I'm the last person to adopt Python, but many of our customers are. Python for input. As great as the dashboard output analysis tool is, a lot of folks love Python, and we have that solution as well. Let's circle back to ERCOT specific again, kind of going back and forth between Probe and ERCOT specific type of questions. So what are the other traits of ERCOT market that make Probe analysis particularly valuable? Anything we haven't hit on? You hit briefly on load growth.
Well, load growth is very important. We test scenarios where we scale load. Outside of what's provided in the off-the-shelf data, we want to test scenarios where that load is increased. And what that lets us look at is, how the generation mix reacts to that load growth and where that load might be causing constraints that we might have not seen in the planning model simulations, for examples. You can model individual loads at the nodal level within Probe as well, instead of breaking down a weather zone load using zonal factors. You can include an individual load if you want to test a data center, for example, and how that might introduce new constraints in the system and how that might impact basis and congestion. So that's a very important aspect of Probe. I also like how Probe uses its solution algorithm to dispatch energy storage. When you look at a Probe simulation and you look at the operation of the storage units, you'll see that they're scheduled in a lot of alignment and synchronization to how markets actually schedule batteries, right? And that is to maximize arbitrage. So you're seeing that the batteries are going to charge when your LMP is low. They're going to discharge when your LMPs are relatively high. And you can see that correlation very clearly. It also maintains the state of charge that the battery starts with. Towards the end of the day, you end up with the same state of charge. And that's a principle that's super important to keep in mind, right? So it encompasses all those great traits and mechanical principles into solution parameters that you can trust. So the ability to model hybrid plants too, that's a hot topic. I think that Probe can tackle really well, is the ability to model hybrid plants and see how your storage might optimize the dispatch of your solar facility as well, for example, as a facility in general. So those are a couple great traits that I like from Probe. Probe has also some great mapping capabilities that lets you see where constraints are relative to your location of your project and see the location of your harmer and helper generators outside of your study unit to those constraints on a geographical interface. So that's also pretty neat. And you can generate power flow cases as well from your Probe simulation that you could also test in Terra, which is a super useful parameter as well, and functionality that Probe offers that we use as well.
Yes, thank you. That's a good point about what we call round trip analysis, right? You can take any hour of the 8760 solution and export a raw file for further analysis in Terra, and that will have saved commitment dispatch. So if you have unusual patterns on a certain day with certain load and renewables, and you want to do further study on that case, you can export it from the Probe solution. Carlos, I'm glad you mentioned scenarios, and easy to run different scenarios in Probe, but I'm guessing you're going to say that we've got load growth, we've got different things happening. I think we have 765 kV transmission coming in ERCOT. So probably Probe aside, in ERCOT, just generally speaking, you probably do want to run a few scenarios of your future, future grid. Is that fair?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's pretty easy to do in probe. Like you mentioned, it's pretty easy to condition raw power flow cases in Terra, and then those are fed into probe. A couple of scenarios that we like to run is what happens if this projected upgrade, let's say it's projected to have an in-service date of 2029, is not completed by then, and that project's really close to where our project's connected to. How might that project look like during that year if that transmission build out is delayed? You know, what happens if we add a significant amount of queued units in the baseline, right, that haven't met the planning 6.91 criteria to be included in the base cases, right? You know, how would that queue attrition compete against your study units? How would increased loads impact the simulation? So those are scenarios that are super important to run to get a perspective on, you know, the range of outcomes that your project might see. And it's pretty easily done within the generator screening function in Probe's data management tool. You can actually test different sizes for your study unit. You could test different topology baseline, different years. And the data management tool, the generator screening function, actually builds those batch scenario files on the back end for you as you're interacting with the user interface. So that's pretty neat, you know. But scenario building is something that's critical for us to understand the range of outcomes the project might face.
Yeah, range of outcomes. That's a good term. I'm going to go ahead and ask my colleague again, Alex Hunter, to put up. I think we have one or two more polls for you folks today. This one is: how are you using production cost model today to understand congestion, curtailment, basis risk? So again, if we can get some folks to weigh in on that, that would be great.
Yeah. So
Yeah, I can.
yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the poll results coming in. I'll make a couple comments on that, and then I'll kick it over to you, Carlos. Yeah, looks like right now it's a mix of in-house consultants. Some people do it some places, some people do it other places. Yeah, we understand. You know, some folks probably do both. I don't know if that was an option here. Some folks, you know, might have in-house and consultants. Having that third-party consulting study, I don't think that's ever going away, right? I compared it the other day in talking to someone that it's kind of like if I'm going for a mortgage, right? I can't self-certify that I'm qualified. You know, there's underwriters that'll take care of all that. So we do understand that the need to have third-party consultants. PowerGen does that. We have consultants that use Probe that do that as well. I really want to leave time for questions. So Carlos, you know, any more comments on this? Then I'll make a few comments and let's get to Q&A because I know there's some good ones out there. Caleb shooting me a few texts or messages here to, you know, Carlos, any, you know, what is important about bringing a tool in-house to you? I think we've covered a lot of it, but, you know, any further thoughts on that?
Well, it has to increase the team's functionality and the level of feedback and the rigor that goes into that feedback. It needs to be there, right? I think that's the only way to justify bringing something in-house, right? Is to enhance the amount of scrutiny we give to a project's analyses in terms of its operational performance and how we project that operational performance, right? There's a lot of tools out there, but I think a tool that is user-friendly, that allows for customization, and that has a support backbone behind it is super important for us to be successful at executing those type of studies. I think PowerGem's support team is nothing short of excellent at, you know, working with customers to really understand the data and the scenarios that each customer wants to drive through, right? These simulations require a lot of input data that has to be carefully curated for you to have meaningful outputs. And I just personally have found that, you know, PowerGem's team is really there to support us, you know, talking about what contingencies to model, for example, what areas of the system to monitor, I know Jim and I have discussed this at length, and it varies by market, right? Each market's different. What contingencies to test? You know, in ERCOT, I usually like to test operational contingencies only, typically P1s or, you know, your automatic single branch outages. But there are other people that might, you know, test a more severe event because they've seen the outage conditions that do materialize and justify the need for that event to be tested during specific times of the year, for example. But you know, those type of conversations are very important to have. It's not just about taking data and mechanically processing it. It's about understanding, you know, what you're doing with the data, what the data, where the data is derived from, and you know, I think Pro does a great job of that.
All right, that's good to hear. I appreciate that comment. Yeah, data is important, right? As much as the software, you need to have good input data to run it. I'm going to go ahead and just take 1 or 2 minutes and give some broader perspectives, background on Probe, and then let's try to save those last 10 minutes for Q&A because I know there's some good questions out there. So yeah, we've talked a lot about ERCOT today. That's the theme. But a lot of these principles, the modeling techniques, the software, they can be applied across markets, right? We have people studying the entire US with Probe, including the non-ISO areas, right? They have a need to study curtailment as well. They might not care so much about pricing if they're not in an LMP market, but studying curtailment is really important, right? So likewise, whereas you can use Probe anywhere, the use cases go well beyond what we're talking about today. So you can also study this combined Terra plus Probe for things like transmission assessment, transmission evaluation, right? Transmission might look good on a reliability basis, but can you also see how good the transmission is on an economic basis? Does it reduce production costs? Does it reduce curtailments? Does it reduce load payments? Things like that. So it's just another area of integration between these types of tools. Storage, obviously a hot topic. That's the chart that we're looking at now at a Probe. You can out of Probe's dashboard tool. You can look at storage on a system-wide basis. What we're looking at here is we can see how I picked a good solar day on purpose to come up with this example. We can see how storage generates. All of a sudden, the sun starts to come up across ERCOT, and it swaps. You're charging all day long, and then you get to 6, 7 p.m., and all of a sudden, you're generating again when the sun goes down. So you can study hybrid storage as transmission asset. But again, the point is you need a through time tool to study storage and find out the hours of charge versus discharge. Aside from these technical use cases, you'll find, I don't know if I've mentioned yet, several of the ISOs licensed Probe. There's a public, that's important, a public study out there PJM just did on the benefit of Pennsylvania, or not benefit, depending upon your perspective, I guess, joining the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So PJM did just post that study publicly, showing Pennsylvania in versus out of RGGI. Again, I'm going to save some of my other comments that I had on my mind and kick it over to Caleb to proceed with the Q&A in just a second. Naturally, if you have more questions or specific use cases you want to discuss, you can find me. Caleb.
Thanks, Jim. Also, just wanted to throw out that if we don't get to all the Q&A or all the questions in the next 10 minutes, we'll make sure to follow up with an email to address those and make sure you guys are satisfied with that. But I guess the first question, I guess this would be for Carlos, but I mean, Jim, you could jump in, but how far into the future do you forecast?
That's a good question. In a market like ERCOT, typically 2 to 4 years out in time, depending on when realistically we could have our interconnection facilities built for the project to physically connect. That would drive the earliest in-service date that we would use as a baseline to forecast. So, we're in 2025 now. If you submit an INR today, you're likely more than likely with procurement lead times, not going to be able to connect before 2028 or even 2029. So that would be the earliest year I would, forecast for a prospecting site. Now, there are sites that are much more mature, right? And we can adjust that year that we forecast, but, typically 3 to 4 years out.
Awesome.
2 to 4, yeah.
Thanks, Carlos. Following up from that, and Jim, this might be for you. What are the inputs to probe power flow case? And I think also another question that actually kind of falls in line with that is, what adjustments, if any, did you have to make with the input files before a simulation? I'm happy to read that second question again.
Yeah, so I can take that one. Probably any of us can take it, but yeah. So what are the inputs, right? So frankly, there's a lot, but we have a data team who develops all this stuff for our customers, right? So the users don't have to worry about that. Sure, they might want to change and put in their own projects, but briefly, you have the power flow model, the raw file, which is the transmission topology, right? So that's the underlying transmission model that goes into the software. Then you have all these other things, like every generator on the system. You have Q power plants, all their characteristics, heat rates and gas prices for thermal generation. For renewables, you need to have a production profile for all your renewable units. I could spend a lot of time talking about the inputs, but it's all the economic inputs, fuel prices, all the generators, ramp rates for thermal units, things like that, storage, efficiency factors. But that's kind of a brief overview of the types of data that goes into probe. It's more than just what would go into your Terra type software. You need that through time economic stuff, like, again, gas prices being one of the best examples, maybe generator outages being another good example. You can't assume nuclear's run 24/7 for the next 10 years.
You need zonal factors as well, zonal factor files. You need hourly demand bid files as well that lets you, decompose the weather zone loads into a nodal load at the hourly level using those zonal factors as well. You also have congestion revenue rights file and ancillary services bids as well. So like Jim mentioned, it's a huge collection of really, really great input data that all feeds into the actual market, right? And the production cost engine to, produce an LMP at the end of the day.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Moving on to the next question. What do banks require from a study that validates its bankability? I know there was some talk around this during our webinar, and I know there's always some talk with our customers around this, but is there any specific things that support this bankability aspect? Maybe for you, Carlos, or if you don't feel comfortable, we can pass it to Jim.
Well, every financial entity has different requirements, but typically the financial entity requests the congestion study to look at different scenarios, and the metrics that we talked about: congestion at the hourly level, curtailment at the hourly level, LP basis at the hourly level, and an analysis on bids as well. I saw a question around what inputs need to be modified to create scenarios. Bids is a very important one at that. From the off-the-shelf data, you get a bid assumption for renewables, and that bid assumption will change your results drastically as you modify it. Before the one big beautiful bill, when tax credits were a little bit more prevalent, we might have included a bid offer that was reflective of the tax credits for your renewable unit, or if your renewable energy was under a PPA structure. But after it rolls off from that, it would have to assume the renewable energy credit value and then adjust your bid as well. So that's something that, is different. There's not a right answer for that. It's depending on how each developer finances its projects, and but it does change your results drastically. So usually financial entities look at that very closely as well.
Awesome. Jim, I'll ask this next question, and maybe you can weave in the bankability piece if it's prevalent. But has there been a validation or benchmarking effort with the probe results? For instance, comparing them with third-party SCAD reports?
Yeah, absolutely, yes. Right. So we benchmark a lot of different ways, right? So where to begin? So, for example, we benchmarked the historic. That's really important. So, for example, one of our data subcontractors, and we rotate through the different areas, right? So, one of our data subcontractors just finished up a NISO benchmark. So, we benchmark LMPs, we benchmark all that stuff, but we benchmark, frankly, everything right down to do we have the same generators running at about the same times? One thing that we just found just the other day in the NISO benchmark, South Fork Wind, the offshore wind project, does not live up to what we expect its capacity factor to be. So we've had to go back and make adjustments in our input data saying, man, we got 2 years of data now showing South Fork Wind, because it's public information, we get it from EIA, it's coming in at like 22% capacity factor. You know, every profile we saw leading up to it going into service was at 32%. For the sake of time, one more brief example. Midwest or Mid-Continent ISO, whatever they call themselves nowadays. We did a benchmark last October. Every hour, every node, every hub, we plotted the probe prices versus the actuals, right? So we do that kind of benchmarking. Other reports, yes, we don't always have access to other reports. We like to benchmark a little bit to the future, which sounds ridiculous, right? But let me explain that. So when you look ahead at the future, right, we have our probe forecast, but there's also a lot of reports out there like SPP's ITP report. It's a public report that it will say, wow, there's a lot of congestion around OPPD, right? So we do our probe benchmark and we say, are we seeing the same congestion? Yes, in fact, we are seeing that same congestion around the data centers in Omaha, but sometimes we might not. That's not necessarily a problem if we can explain it. We can say, hey, no, we stand by this probe result. I mean, if you assume this is going to be built here, it makes some sense that there might be a little bit of congestion over here. So I might not be able to speak to why they don't see it, but I can defend the result from probe. Trying to be as brief on that one as possible. Do we have time for one more, Caleb?
I think we're at time here. I wanted to just thank everybody for joining. We will follow up with some feedback to the questions that we didn't get to. We really appreciate everyone's participation and time. We know that an hour is a lot to ask, but we really are thankful for that. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to sales at PowerGem or reach out to one of us directly. And a specific shout out to Carlos for taking the time to join us today. Thank you.
No, thank you guys. Really appreciate everyone's time.
Awesome.
All right.
Have a good
Thanks,
weekend.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
All right.